The evening had begun like any other. The faint aroma of the dinner Stella had prepared still lingered in the kitchen. Jamie sat at the table, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. The crackle of the wood-burning fireplace filled the silence, a sound that usually brought him comfort. But tonight, it only seemed to amplify the stillness. He stared at the mug, lost in thought, his mind wandering through the mundane details of the day. The sound of footsteps broke through his reverie. He glanced up, expecting to see Stella, but something in the way she entered the room caught his attention. Her movements were deliberate, each step measured, as if she were carrying a heavy burden. She leaned against the counter, her eyes fixed on him, scanning his face for any sign of what he might be thinking. "Jamie," she began, her voice carrying a note of determination, but also something else, something he couldn't quite place. He looked up at her, concern flickering in his eyes. "What is it, Stella?" he asked, his voice steady, though a slight unease had begun to creep into his mind. She hesitated, as if considering whether to go through with whatever she had planned. The silence between them stretched out. Jamie felt the tension, though he couldn't understand its source. Finally, Stella took a deep breath and seemed to steel herself. "There's someone I want you to meet," she said, the words coming out more forcefully than she might have intended. Jamie's brow furrowed in confusion. "Someone to meet? What do you mean?" His voice carried a hint of suspicion, though he tried to keep it neutral. Without waiting for his response, Stella turned her head slightly, gesturing toward the doorway. A figure emerged from the shadows, stepping into the dim light of the kitchen. Jamie's eyes narrowed as he took in the sight of the man who now stood before him, a tall, muscular figure with a presence that seemed to dominate the room. "This is Alex," Stella said, her voice firmer now, as if she had resolved herself to see this through. "He'll be staying here with us from now on." Jamie's grip tightened around the mug. The words hit him like a physical blow, and for a moment, he couldn't process what she had just said. "Staying with us?" he repeated, his voice flat, betraying none of the storm that had begun to brew inside him. Stella didn't flinch. "Yes, I want you to share me with him," she stated bluntly, her arms crossing over her chest in a defiant posture. "You can't say no, Jamie. If you try to resist—" She paused, and for the first time, Jamie saw a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. "Alex will break your jaw." Jamie sat motionless, his mind racing to catch up with the reality that had just been thrust upon him. He shifted his gaze from Stella to Alex, who stood silently, watching him with a smug expression. The tension in the room was palpable, each second stretching into eternity. The cold fury that had been simmering inside Jamie began to bubble up to the surface, but he forced himself to remain calm. Without a word, he pushed his chair back, the wooden legs scraping against the floor with an ominous screech. He rose slowly, his eyes never leaving Alex's. The silence in the room was suffocating as Jamie turned and walked out of the kitchen. His footsteps echoed down the hallway, each step measured and deliberate. Stella watched him go, her heart pounding in her chest, unsure of what he was going to do. She had expected anger, shouting, maybe even tears, but not this eerie, controlled silence. Alex smirked, clearly enjoying the discomfort he had caused. "See? I told you that Lucer wouldn't stand up to me," he said, his voice dripping with arrogance. But Stella didn't respond. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The way Jamie had walked out, the calmness in his demeanor, it wasn't what she had anticipated. Her mind raced with 1,000 possibilities, each one more terrifying than the last. The sound of footsteps returned, cutting through her thoughts. Jamie was coming back. She turned to the doorway, her breath catching in her throat as she saw him re-enter the room. His expression was unreadable, but there was a hardness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. In his hand, he held something that made her blood run cold, a hunting knife, its blade gleaming under the soft light of the kitchen. "Jamie, what are you?" Stella started to speak, her voice trembling, but the words died in her throat as she saw the look on his face. Before she could react, Jamie moved with a speed and precision that caught both her and Alex off guard. He closed the distance between himself and Alex in a heartbeat, the knife flashing through the air with deadly intent. Alex's arrogant smirk vanished as he realized what was happening, but it was too late. Jamie's first strike was swift and brutal, the blade slicing across Alex's arm. The man let out a roar of pain, staggering back as he clutched at the wound. Blood seeped through his fingers, staining the floor beneath him. The reality of the situation crashed down on him. This was not going to be an easy fight. Stella screamed, the sound a mixture of fear and shock. She stumbled back, her hands covering her mouth as she watched in horror. "Jamie, stop! What are you doing?" But Jamie didn't respond. His focus was entirely on Alex, his movements calculated and relentless. He moved in again, the knife aimed at Alex's midsection. Alex, desperate to defend himself, swung his fist at Jamie, but the blow glanced off his shoulder, doing little to deter him. Jamie's hand tightened around the knife, his movements quick and precise. Alex barely had time to react. He took a step back, his eyes widening in surprise. But the knife was faster, and he let out a roar of pain, staggering back as blood began to flow from the deep gash. "You think you can just waltz into my house and threaten me?" Jamie growled, his voice low and menacing. He took a step forward, his eyes locked onto Alex's. There was no hesitation, no fear, only cold, calculated anger. Alex clutched his arm, trying to stem the bleeding, his expression shifting from shock to fury. "You're insane," he spat, his voice laced with a mixture of pain and disbelief. "Jamie, stop!" Stella screamed again, her voice rising in panic. She took a step toward him, her hand outstretched as if she could somehow stop the violence that had already begun. Alex, regaining some of his composure, lunged at Jamie, using his larger frame to his advantage. He slammed into Jamie, sending them both crashing into the wall. The impact forced the knife from Jamie's hand, and it clattered to the floor, sliding just out of reach. For a moment, it seemed like Alex might have the upper hand. He pressed Jamie against the wall, his face twisted in rage. "You're nothing," Alex sneered, his voice dripping with contempt. He leaned in close, his breath hot against Jamie's face. "Just a pathetic loser who couldn't even keep his wife satisfied." Jamie's eyes narrowed, but he didn't respond. His mind was already calculating, assessing the situation, searching for an opportunity. His gaze flicked to the knife, lying just a few feet away on the floor. He knew he had to reach it before Alex could do any more damage. With a sudden burst of strength, fueled by the adrenaline coursing through his veins, Jamie shoved Alex off of him. Alex stumbled back, caught off guard by the force of the push. Without wasting a second, Jamie dived for the knife, his hand closing around the hilt just as Alex regained his balance and charged at him again. This time, Jamie was ready. As Alex closed in, Jamie twisted his body, bringing the knife up in a swift, brutal motion. The blade drove into Alex's side with a sickening thud. Alex gasped, his momentum carrying him forward as the knife tore through flesh and muscle. His eyes widened in shock, the pain hitting him like a freight train. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The only sound was Alex's ragged breathing, each breath a struggle as he clutched at the wound, his hand coming away slick with blood. He stumbled back, his strength draining away with each passing second. Stella screamed again, the sound high-pitched and desperate, cutting through the tension like a knife. She ran to Alex, dropping to her knees beside him. Her hands trembled as she tried to apply pressure to the wound, but the blood kept coming, staining her hands and pooling on the floor beneath them. "Oh my God, Jamie, what have you done?" she sobbed, her voice breaking as she looked up at her husband. Her eyes were wide with horror and disbelief, as if she couldn't comprehend what had just happened. Jamie stood over them, his chest heaving with the effort of the fight. He didn't answer her immediately. Instead, he stared down at Alex, watching as the life slowly drained out of him. There was no satisfaction in his expression, no sense of triumph, only a cold, hard resolve. Alex tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. His body was failing him, the pain too overwhelming. His gaze shifted from Jamie to Stella, as if seeking some kind of reassurance, some final comfort. But there was nothing she could do for him now. "What I should have done the moment you disrespected our marriage," Jamie finally said, his voice sharp and unwavering. He looked down at Stella, meeting her tear-filled eyes. There was no pity in his gaze, no regret. Just the cold, hard truth of what had to be done. Stella shook her head, unable to process the situation. "We need to call an ambulance," she said, her voice trembling. She fumbled for her phone, her fingers slick with blood, but her hands were shaking too much to dial. "Jamie, please, he's dying." Jamie didn't move. He watched as Stella struggled with the phone, her desperation growing with each passing second. But there was no going back now, no undoing what had been done. He had made his choice, and so had she. "You bitch brought him here," Jamie said quietly, his voice calm but cold. "You brought this on yourself." Stella finally managed to dial the emergency number, but she knew it was too late. The blood was pouring from Alex's wound too quickly, pooling around them, staining her clothes, her hands, the floor. She pressed her hands harder against the wound, but it was like trying to hold back the tide. Alex's breathing grew more labored, each breath a struggle as his strength waned. "Stay with me, Alex," Stella pleaded, her voice frantic. "Help is coming, just hold on." But Alex didn't respond. His eyes were glazed over, his body growing weaker by the second. He tried to focus on her, but his vision was fading, the world around him slipping away. His grip on her hand loosened, his head slumping forward. "Jamie, do something!" Stella cried, looking up at her husband, her face a mask of fear and desperation. "We can't just let him die." But Jamie didn't answer. He simply stood there, watching as Alex's life ebbed away. In his mind, this was the only way it could have ended. There was no saving Alex, no saving his marriage. The betrayal had cut too deep, leaving scars that could never heal. The sound of sirens in the distance broke through the silence, growing louder as they approached. Stella's heart raced, hope and fear mingling in equal measure. She looked back down at Alex, but his eyes were closed now, his breathing shallow and uneven. The life that had once filled him, the arrogance and bravado, was gone, replaced by a cold, empty shell. "Jamie, please," Stella whispered, her voice barely audible. But there was nothing left to say. The door burst open as paramedics rushed in, their movements quick and efficient. They pushed Stella aside, assessing Alex's condition with grim faces. One of them radioed for backup, the urgency in his voice unmistakable. But even as they worked, it was clear to everyone in the room that it was too late. Stella watched in numb silence as the paramedics tried to stabilize Alex, their hands moving with practiced precision. But she could see it in their faces, the way they exchanged glances, the subtle shake of a head. They were fighting a losing battle. Jamie stepped back, giving them space, but his eyes never left Alex. He watched as the paramedics lifted him onto a stretcher, the blood-soaked sheets a stark contrast against his pale skin. They moved quickly, but there was a finality to their actions, a sense of inevitability that hung heavy in the air. Stella tried to follow them as they wheeled Alex out of the house, but one of the paramedics gently held her back. "Ma'am, you need to stay here," he said, his voice calm but firm. "We're doing everything we can." She nodded, too overwhelmed to argue, her eyes following the stretcher as it disappeared through the door. The house was eerily quiet in the aftermath, the only sound the distant wail of the ambulance as it sped away, carrying Alex to the hospital. Jamie stood in the middle of the room, his breathing still heavy, his mind replaying the events of the last few minutes. He knew that there would be consequences for what he had done, but he didn't care. The rage that had driven him to this point was gone, replaced by a cold clarity. Stella turned to face him, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "What are we going to do?" she asked, her voice small and broken. Jamie looked at her, his expression unreadable. "I'm going to tell them the truth," he said, his voice steady. "And then we'll see what happens." Stella nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of what had just occurred. There was no escaping it now, no turning back. They had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and the consequences would follow them for the rest of their lives. The house, once filled with the chaos of conflict, now lay in an unsettling silence. The only sound that punctuated the stillness was Stella's muffled sobs as she knelt beside Alex, desperately trying to keep him conscious. Her hands were slick with his blood, pressing futilely against the wound that continued to bleed out, staining the floor beneath them. Alex's breath came in ragged gasps, each one shallower than the last. Jamie stood a few feet away, his eyes locked on the scene in front of him. His grip on the knife had loosened, but the tension in his body remained. He watched Stella, his emotions a tangled mess. There was a part of him, deep down, that felt a dark satisfaction. He had defended his pride, his home. But another part of him, the part that had loved Stella for years, felt nothing but a deep, gnawing emptiness. "Stella," Jamie finally spoke, his voice softer now, the anger that had fueled him dissipating into something more complex, more painful. "Why did you do this?" Stella looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her expression a mix of fear, guilt, and regret. Her voice was barely audible as she choked out her answer. I don't know, Jamie. I was bored. I was lonely. I thought you wouldn't care. I want the attention." Jamie let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head in disbelief. "You thought I wouldn't care? You were my world, Stella. I gave you everything, and you threw it away for this?" He gestured toward Alex, who was now barely conscious, his life slipping away with every passing second. Stella couldn't bring herself to meet his gaze. She knew she had betrayed him in the worst possible way, and the weight of that guilt was crushing. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but even as she said the words, she knew they were hollow. What did an apology mean now, after everything that had happened? Jamie's eyes flicked back to Alex. The man was slipping in and out of consciousness, his breathing shallow and labored. There was a time, maybe even just an hour ago, when Jamie might have felt pity or guilt. But now, all he felt was cold detachment. He knew Alex wouldn't last much longer without medical help, but he couldn't bring himself to care. "You've made your bed, Stella," Jamie said coldly, his voice hardening again as the reality of the situation settled over him. "Now lie in it." Without another word, Jamie turned and walked out of the room. Stella's sobs grew louder, but he didn't stop. He stepped out into the cool night air, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The sudden quiet of the outside world contrasted sharply with the storm of emotions inside him. The burden he had carried for so long, the doubt, the anger, the pain, seemed to lift, replaced by a strange sense of clarity. Jamie walked down the steps of the porch, his feet carrying him to the edge of the property. The night was still, the stars twinkling in the clear sky above him, indifferent to the turmoil that had unfolded below. He stood there for a moment, breathing deeply, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The adrenaline that had fueled him during the confrontation was fading, leaving behind a hollow ache in his chest. As he looked out into the darkness, memories of the life he had built with Stella flashed through his mind. The early days of their relationship, the laughter, the plans they had made for the future, it all felt so distant now, like it had happened to someone else. The woman inside that house, the one sobbing over her dying lover, wasn't the Stella he had once known. Or maybe she was, and he had just been too blind to see it. He thought about the last few months, how distant she had become, how the spark in her eyes had faded. He had noticed it, of course, but he had convinced himself that it was just a phase, that they would get through it. He had been so sure that their love was strong enough to survive anything. But now, standing there in the cool night air, he realized how wrong he had been. His thoughts were interrupted by the distant sound of sirens. The paramedics would be here soon, and they would take Alex away, try to save him. But Jamie knew it was too late. The damage had been done, and nothing could change that now. He turned and looked back at the house, the soft glow of the lights spilling out onto the lawn. For a moment, he considered going back inside, checking on Stella, seeing if there was anything left to salvage. But then he remembered the coldness in her voice when she had introduced Alex, the way she had looked at him with something close to contempt. No, there was nothing left for him in that house. The life he had known was over, and there was no going back. Jamie walked to the edge of the driveway, his steps slow and deliberate. He could hear the sirens getting closer, but he didn't hurry. There was no need to. The authorities would come, they would ask questions, and he would tell them the truth. There was no point in hiding it. He had done what he had to do. He had defended himself, his home, his pride. As he reached the end of the driveway, he stopped and turned back one last time. The house stood there, silent and still, a monument to the life he had lost. He felt a pang of regret, but it was quickly swallowed by the cold clarity that had settled over him. The sirens were loud now, just around the corner. Jamie took a deep breath, steadying himself. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew that whatever happened next, he would face it head-on, just like he had tonight. The flashing lights appeared at the end of the street, and Jamie stood there, waiting for them. As the ambulance and police cars pulled into the driveway, he felt an odd sense of peace. He had faced the worst, and he had survived. Now, all that was left was to deal with the aftermath. The paramedics rushed past him, barely giving him a second glance as they hurried into the house. Jamie watched them go, his heart pounding in his chest, but his mind calm. The police approached him, their expressions serious, but he didn't flinch. He was ready. "Sir, we need to ask you some questions," one of the officers said, his voice firm but not unkind. Jamie nodded. "I'll tell you everything," he said quietly, his voice steady. And he would. There was no point in lying, no point in trying to cover up what had happened. The truth was clear, laid out in the blood-stained floor of his home. As he stood there, under the flashing lights of the police cars, Jamie realized that this was his new beginning. The past was gone, shattered beyond repair. But the future, whatever it held, was his to shape. As the officer led him to the car, Jamie took one last look at the house, now swarming with paramedics and police. He knew he would never return here, never again walk through those doors. And that was okay. It was time to move on, to leave the past behind. Jamie closed his eyes as he sat down in the back of the police car, feeling the weight of the night lift off his shoulders. He didn't know where he was going, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was heading in the right direction. The days after the incident passed in a whirlwind. The arrival of the police had marked the end of the nightmare that had unfolded in Jamie's home. Alex was dead by the time they arrived, a consequence of the chaos he had unwittingly walked into. The officers had taken Jamie into custody, his hands cuffed behind his back as Stella's frantic cries echoed through the house. Her face was a mask of horror and disbelief, but Jamie felt nothing as he was led away. The storm had come, and now it was over. Jamie sat in the cold, sterile interrogation room, waiting for his lawyer to arrive. The room was stark, the walls a dull gray, the table and chairs functional but uncomfortable. He stared at the one-way mirror, knowing there were eyes on him, assessing, judging. Yet he felt strangely detached from it all, as if the events had happened to someone else. His lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman with a reputation for winning tough cases, eventually arrived. She listened to his account, her expression unreadable, before nodding and assuring him that they would fight this as a case of self-defense. The legal battle that followed was grueling. The prosecution painted a picture of a jealous, violent husband who had snapped, while his defense argued that he had acted in self-defense, pushed to the brink by the betrayal and the imminent threat to his life. Stella testified, her voice shaky as she recounted the events of that night. Jamie could see the guilt in her eyes, but she never looked at him directly. In the end, the evidence, or lack thereof, played in his favor. Alex had come into Jamie's home uninvited, had threatened him, and in the ensuing struggle, Jamie had done what he had to do. The charges were dropped, and Jamie walked out of the courthouse a free man, but the experience had left him exhausted, both mentally and physically. Stella didn't fare as well. The affair and the violence that had followed became the talk of the town. The once respected wife, known for her poise and grace, was now a subject of scandal and whispers. The judgment from those who had once been her friends was harsh and unforgiving. Unable to face the humiliation, she packed her bags and left town, disappearing without a trace. Jamie heard from mutual acquaintances that she had moved to another state, but he didn't ask for details. He knew that chapter of his life was closed for good. As the months went by, Jamie found himself at a crossroads. The house where he and Stella had shared so many memories, both good and bad, no longer felt like home. Every corner, every room, held the echoes of a life that was now gone. It was too much, the weight of the past suffocating him. So, he made a decision. He sold the house, leaving behind the ghost of his former life, and bought a small cabin in the mountains, far from the town where everything had unraveled. The cabin was isolated, surrounded by towering trees and the soothing sounds of nature. It was a place where he could be alone with his thoughts, away from the prying eyes and judgmental stares of others. The first few weeks were difficult. The silence was oppressive, and the memories of that night haunted him, replaying in his mind like a never-ending loop. But gradually, the quiet solitude of the mountains began to heal him. Jamie fell into a simple routine. He spent his mornings hiking through the dense forest, feeling the cool mountain air on his skin and the ground crunching beneath his boots. In the afternoons, he would fish in the nearby river, his mind focused solely on the line and the water, a welcome distraction from his thoughts. The evenings were spent by the fire, the warmth of the flames offering comfort as he sipped on a cup of coffee or a glass of whiskey. The simplicity of this new life brought him a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. There were no expectations, no pressures, just him, the mountains, and the quiet. Slowly but surely, the memories of Stella and Alex began to fade, their power over him diminishing with each passing day. He no longer woke up in a cold sweat, haunted by nightmares. Instead, he found himself looking forward to each new day, to the tranquility and the solitude that had become his sanctuary. One evening, as he sat by the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker, Jamie realized something. For the first time in what felt like forever, he was content. He had faced the darkest moments of his life, and though he had emerged scarred, he had also emerged stronger. The betrayal, the violence, the loss, it was all behind him now, a part of his past that he had finally laid to rest. As the fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the small cabin, Jamie allowed himself a smile. He had taken back control of his life, reclaimed his sense of self. The man who had once been broken by betrayal had rebuilt himself, piece by piece, in the quiet solitude of the mountains. He had found a new beginning, a chance to live life on his own terms, without the shadows of the past looming over him. The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, Jamie wasn't afraid of what it might hold. He had faced the worst, and he had survived. Now, as he looked into the dancing flames, he saw not just the end of a chapter, but the beginning of a new one. The past was behind him, and the future, whatever it might bring, was his to shape.